They called him unstable. They said the war broke his mind. But when the rain wouldn't stop and the mountain began to move, it wasn't the town leaders who noticed first. It was a quiet veteran on the hillside and a K9 who refused to stop barking at the ground beneath their feet. While others laughed, he dug. While others slept, he listened. And when the creek finally exploded out of its banks, his crazy plan became the only path that didn't drown. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Juniper Ridge, Oregon sat where the rain forgot how to stop. The town was tucked between dark ridgelines and a swollen ribbon of creek that locals pretended was harmless until it wasn't. In late autumn, the sky often stayed the color of pewter for days. Clouds pressed low enough to snag the tops of Douglas firs, and the air carried that cold, wet bite that seeped through denim and into bone. Fog pooled in the streets each morning like a slow tide, blurring porch lights and mailbox numbers, turning familiar corners into soft silhouettes. It was a beautiful place in the way a knife could be beautiful, clean, quiet, and unforgiving if you held it wrong. Ethan Crossley lived above town, halfway up the northern slope where the trees grew dense and the ground never fully dried. His cabin wasn't much: rough cedar boards, a patched metal roof, a narrow porch that bowed slightly in the center from years of moisture. But it stood where he needed it, high enough to watch the valley, far enough away to keep people from asking questions he didn't want to answer. Ethan was 36, built lean and hard the way men get when they've spent years carrying weight they didn't choose. He moved with a soldier's economy, shoulders squared out of habit, but there was a careful stiffness in his left knee that made him favor certain steps. His hair was dark brown, kept short and practical, usually hidden under a faded cap. A trimmed stubble shadowed his jaw, emphasizing cheekbones that looked more carved than grown. The most striking thing about him was his gaze, steady, dark, scanning without looking frantic. He didn't stare at people so much as he measured distance, exits, angles. It wasn't rudeness. It was training that didn't leave when the uniform did. Some nights the war still came home with him anyway, slipping into his sleep in the shape of a sudden noise or a memory he couldn't name. He handled it the only way he knew, by staying busy, staying useful, staying prepared. Valkyrie, Val, was why he managed to keep breathing on the worst days. She was a Belgian Malinois, 5 years old, all muscle and alertness, with a sleek fawn coat and a black mask that made her amber eyes look sharper than they already were. Her ears stood tall and expressive, flicking at the smallest sound, and her tail stayed still unless she chose to let it move. Val was not a pet in the sentimental sense. She was a working dog who happened to love one person more than her own comfort. A thin scar traced her shoulder where shrapnel once kissed too close, and Ethan swore she remembered it on nights when thunder rolled low and distant. In the mornings, she moved like a compass, nose low, reading the world through scent the way Ethan read it through shapes and silence. That day began with mist so thick it turned the forest into a watercolor. Ethan stepped onto the porch, breathing in damp cedar and wet soil, and watched the ridgeline disappear into gray. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but the land still sounded saturated. Water dripping from needles, a slow trickle somewhere under leaves, the occasional plop of runoff striking a rock. Val trotted ahead of him along the narrow path behind the cabin, paws quiet on the spongy ground. She stopped near a stand of older trees, cedar roots lifting the earth into knuckled ridges, and froze. Her body went rigid, not with fear but focus. Then she barked once, sharp and clean, and backed away from a patch of soil that looked no different from any other. Ethan crouched. The ground there was darker, almost bruised in tone, and when he pressed his palm into it, the mud yielded too easily, as if the hillside had become a soaked mattress. He lifted his hand and watched the surface shiver, settling a fraction lower than it should. Val's nose hovered inches above the spot, nostrils flaring. Her hackles didn't rise, but her eyes narrowed the way they did when she found something hidden. Ethan leaned closer and caught a faint odor beneath the moss and rot, something metallic, something sour, like mineral water gone bad. It wasn't strong. It didn't need to be. In other places, in other years, he'd learned to respect small signals. A soft patch of soil could be nothing, or it could be the first word in a sentence the mountain was about to finish with violence. He stood slowly, letting his weight settle carefully onto firmer ground, and Val pressed against his leg once, an anchor, a reminder. "Good," he murmured, voice low, more for himself than her. He didn't like how the earth felt lately. The rain had been persistent, the kind that didn't flood dramatically all at once, but instead weakened everything by degrees, turning slope into slickness and roots into failing stitches. Juniper Ridge had been built by people who believed the forest would always hold. Ethan knew better than to trust always. He needed supplies, nails, rope, maybe a roll of plastic sheeting if Marvin still had any. He clipped Val's leash and started down toward town along a dirt track that bent through wet alder and fern. As they descended, the fog thinned slightly, revealing rooftops below, modest houses with peeling paint, old trucks in driveways, smoke lifting from chimneys in hesitant threads. The creek ran along the edge of town, louder than it should have been for a morning without rain. Ethan listened to it the way a man listens to breathing. Steady meant alive. Too fast meant trouble. Juniper Ridge's main street was small enough that you could walk it end to end before your coffee cooled. The diner sat near the corner, a narrow building with fogged windows and a neon sign that flickered on cold days. Inside, warmth and the smell of fried potatoes hit like a blanket. Lila Hartman looked up from behind the counter when the bell above the door chimed. She was in her early 30s, tall and slim, with a tired grace that came from moving quickly for years without anyone taking the load off her shoulders. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, strands escaping to curl around her cheeks. Her skin was fair with a scatter of freckles across her nose and collarbones, and her eyes, a soft hazel, held the kind of alertness that came from listening for needs before they were spoken. She had a gentle voice, but there was steel beneath it, a firmness born from balancing bills, work shifts, and a child who depended on her as if she were the only stable thing in a shifting world. "No rain for 5 minutes, and it still feels like the air's dripping," she said, half smiling as Ethan approached. She didn't flirt. She didn't pry. She simply spoke to him like he belonged in the room, which mattered more than she probably knew. Her son, Noah, sat in a booth by the window with a sketchbook open. He was 10, narrow-shouldered and long-limbed, the kind of kid who hadn't grown into his body yet. His hair was a messy, sandy blonde that refused to lie flat, and his knees were scabbed in the honest way of boys who still climbed things. When he saw Val, his face brightened with a pure, eager wonder. He slid out of the booth and approached slowly, hands visible the way he'd clearly been taught. "Hi, Val," he whispered, like he was greeting someone important. Val sniffed his fingers once, then allowed a single slow wag of her tail. Noah exhaled as if he'd been granted access to a sacred place. "You're training her?" he asked Ethan, eyes wide. "She trained me," Ethan said, and Lila gave a quiet laugh that sounded like relief. Ethan kept the stop short, coffee, a few words, the brief warmth of being somewhere human. Lila wrapped a biscuit in paper and pushed it toward him without making a show of it. "For later," she said, as if she didn't notice the way Ethan's shoulders eased a fraction when someone offered something without demanding anything back. Back outside, he crossed to Sloan Hardware. Marvin Sloan stood inside the doorway, a stocky man in his late 60s with a barrel chest and thick forearms that still looked capable despite the tremor in his hands. His beard was dense and white, trimmed close to his jaw, and his eyebrows were heavy enough to cast shadows over watery blue eyes. Marvin had the kind of friendliness that came with rules. You could borrow his ladder if you returned it. You could talk in his shop if you didn't waste his time. Loss had shaped him. People in town said he'd gotten quieter after his brother drowned in a flood years ago. But he was still here, still opening the door every morning, still sweeping rainwater off the steps like it was an act of defiance. "Crossley," Marvin greeted, glancing down at Val with cautious respect. "Your dog's got better sense than half this town." Ethan bought nails, rope, and a small spade that felt right in his hand. As Marvin rang him up, 2 men in muddy boots talked near the paint aisle about a low rumble they'd heard last night up by the North Ridge. Ethan didn't turn his head, but his attention sharpened. Val's ears flicked forward. The men shrugged it off as logging trucks or thunder, but Ethan knew the difference between noise and warning. When he stepped back into the foggy street, the creak sounded louder again, as if it had crept closer while no one was looking. He started up the hill with supplies in hand, Val at his side, the biscuit warm in his jacket pocket. Behind him, Juniper Ridge carried on with its morning routines. Coffee poured, doors unlocked, conversations started and ended. Above him, the slope waited under its blanket of wet soil, quiet in the way a thing could be quiet right before it moved. Val glanced toward the trees once more, body tightening for a heartbeat. Ethan followed her gaze into the mist and felt that familiar, unwelcome certainty settle into his chest. The mountain was saying something. Whether anyone else would listen was another matter. By the time Ethan Crossley reached his cabin again, the fog had begun to thin in uneven patches, lifting just enough to reveal the darker shapes of trees clinging to the slope above him. The supplies from town weighed lightly in his pack, but the feeling in his chest had grown heavier with every step uphill. The creek sound followed him even here, a persistent rush that didn't match the sky's brief calm. Water was still moving somewhere it shouldn't, still finding paths no one had planned for. Val slowed near the same stand of cedars as before, her gait changing from fluid to deliberate. She circled once, nose low, then stopped and stared downslope, ears locked forward. Ethan didn't need the bark this time. He could feel it through the soles of his boots, the faint vibration of ground that hadn't decided whether it wanted to hold or give. He knelt, set the pack down, and drove the small spade into the earth a few inches from the earlier soft patch. The blade slid in too easily. When he levered it back, water seeped up from the cut, clouded with fine gray sediment. "Not good," he muttered. Val huffed softly, a sound she made when something didn't add up. She moved a few feet away and scratched at another spot, then another, creating a rough line that curved along the slope. Ethan followed the line with his eyes and felt a cold clarity settle in. Whatever was happening wasn't isolated. It was spreading, following the lay of the land like a sentence writing itself across the hillside. He spent the afternoon testing, measuring with his eyes, pacing distances the way he once paced perimeters. He marked trees with bits of orange cord from his pack, tracing a potential route where water could be coaxed away rather than allowed to gather force. It wasn't a plan yet, more a conversation with the terrain, but it was enough to tell him one thing with certainty: waiting would make everything worse. As evening crept in, the sky darkened again, clouds stacking low and heavy over the ridge. Ethan built a small fire in the stove and ate the biscuit Lila had given him, breaking it in half and handing the other piece to Val, who accepted it gently. The cabin smelled of smoke and damp wool. For a while, the quiet held. Then, just after dusk, a sound rolled through the ground, not loud, not dramatic, but deep enough to be felt rather than heard. Val lifted her head instantly, eyes sharp, body taut. Ethan stood, heart thudding. The sound came again, like a long breath exhaled by the earth itself. He didn't sleep much that night. Rain returned in fits, tapping the roof, pausing, then starting again with renewed insistence. Each time the wind rose, Val paced the cabin's narrow length, checking the door, the window, the corners, as if the danger might slip inside on four legs. When dawn finally arrived, pale and reluctant, Ethan knew he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. The mountain was no longer whispering. It was clearing its throat. He went down to town early, Val close at heel. Juniper Ridge looked tired in the morning light. Mud streaked the edges of the road, and the creek had crept higher overnight, licking at the stones along its banks. Outside the diner, a man leaned against a pickup truck, smoking. He was tall and rangy, late 40s, with a narrow face and a beard that had gone mostly gray without ever being properly trimmed. His name was Lucas Reed, a part-time logger and full-time observer of other people's business. Lucas had the posture of someone who'd spent too long waiting for things to get better and learned instead to expect disappointment. He nodded once at Ethan, eyes flicking to Val. "Dog's restless," Lucas said. "Animals know before we do." Ethan didn't disagree. Inside the diner, Lila moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her smile polite but strained. Business had been slow since the rain started, and worry had a way of showing up in the shoulders before it ever reached the face. She poured Ethan coffee without asking. Noah wasn't there. School bus hadn't come through yet, she explained quietly. Road inspection or something like that. Another small inconvenience, another thread of unease. You look like you didn't sleep, Lila said. I didn't, Ethan replied. He hesitated, then added, The ground up north is shifting, more than yesterday. She stilled for a moment, fingers tightening on the coffee pot. Should I be worried? Not yet, he said, choosing the words carefully, but soon, if it keeps raining. She nodded, trusting him without demanding proof, and that trust weighed on him more than skepticism ever could. From the diner, Ethan went straight to the sheriff's office. The building was small, brick-darkened by years of damp air, a single flag drooping outside. Sheriff Mara Keene stood at her desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms corded with muscle. She was in her early 40s, with sharp cheekbones and close-cropped dark hair that framed a face made for decisions rather than comfort. Her eyes were a cool gray, direct to the point of bluntness. People in Juniper Ridge said she'd been different before her husband died in a highway accident 5 years back. Softer, quicker to laugh. Grief hadn't broken her, but it had compressed her, turned every emotion into something dense and functional. What have you got, Crossley? She asked, not unkindly. Ethan laid it out plainly. The soft soil, the seepage, the rumble. He didn't dramatize. He didn't ask for anything yet. He simply described what he'd seen and what Val had flagged. Mara listened, arms crossed, jaw tight. We've had slides before, she said. Small ones. Nothing catastrophic. Until they are, Ethan replied. She exhaled through her nose, considering. I'll have the county take a look, but they're backed up and funding's thin. In the meantime, don't start digging trenches on private land. Ethan held her gaze. I'm going to dig where it's already breaking. That's still land, she said. Then, after a pause, just be careful. It wasn't permission, but it wasn't a shutdown either. Outside, Val tugged lightly on the leash, pulling Ethan toward the edge of town where the old logging road began. There, he saw a man inspecting a culvert half-choked with debris. The man was broad-shouldered, early 50s, with thick black hair combed back and a neatly shaped beard that did little to soften the hardness in his eyes. Gideon Rourke looked like someone accustomed to rooms making space for him. His clothes were clean despite the mud around him, boots expensive and mostly unused. Years of control, over land, over jobs, over narratives, had given him a confidence that bordered on contempt. Rourke straightened when he noticed Ethan. You're the one stirring talk about landslides, he said, voice smooth, practiced. This town doesn't need panic. It needs preparation, Ethan answered. Rourke smiled thinly. Preparation costs money. Panic costs more. You do well to remember who keeps Juniper Ridge working. The exchange ended there, but the line had been drawn. Ethan left town with a sense of urgency sharpened by resistance. Back on the slope, he began cutting shallow channels where runoff already wanted to go, reinforcing them with stones and fallen branches. Val stayed close, sometimes standing watch, sometimes trotting ahead to test ground Ethan hadn't reached yet. Late in the afternoon, hooves clopped along the lower path. Ethan looked up to see a chestnut horse led by a woman wrapped in a rain poncho. The horse, named Bramble, was old by working standards, with a white blaze down its nose and patient, clouded eyes. The woman, May Holloway, was slight and weathered, her gray hair braided down her back. She lived on the outskirts of town and trusted animals more than people. That hill's always been temperamental, May called, but it's never felt nervous before. Ethan nodded. It is now. May studied the channels he'd started, then Val. If you need stones, I've got plenty by the fence line. Take what you want. It wasn't much, but it was the first unsolicited offer. As night fell again, rain returned, heavier this time. Ethan stood on his porch, watching water follow the first shallow grooves he'd carved, redirecting just enough to ease the pressure near the soft patches. It wasn't a solution. It was a test. Val sat beside him, steady and alert, her presence a quiet promise. Down in Juniper Ridge, lights flickered on one by one as people settled in for another wet night, unaware that the shape of their safety was already being negotiated on the hillside above them. The mountain hadn't moved yet, but it was thinking about it, and Ethan knew that once it decided, no amount of denial would hold it back. The rain did not announce itself that morning. It simply continued, as if it had never stopped. Ethan Crossley woke before dawn to the sound of water moving where it shouldn't, a soft, continuous whisper sliding along the shallow channels he had cut the day before. He lay still for a moment, listening, cataloging the sounds the way he once cataloged distant engines or wind over wire. Val was already awake, sitting near the door, ears forward, her posture alert, but not alarmed. That alone told him something had changed. The hillside was no longer testing him. It was responding. Outside, the grooves he'd carved were holding, barely. Water flowed along the intended lines, thin but steady, tracing the slope in dark ribbons. The ground beyond them still looked wrong, too smooth, too swollen, but the immediate pressure had eased. Ethan exhaled slowly. It wasn't victory. It was time bought with a shovel and instinct. By mid-morning, he was reinforcing the channels with stones from May Holloway's fence line. May watched from a distance, leaning on the rail, her chestnut horse Bramble shifting its weight patiently beside her. Bramble's coat was duller in the wet light, age showing in the slack of his muscles, but his eyes followed Ethan's movements with calm interest. May herself looked carved from the same landscape, short, wiry, skin weathered to the color of old leather, gray braid tight against her back. She spoke little, but when she did, it was with the certainty of someone who had outlasted many wrong predictions. "You're changing how the water thinks," she said at last. "I'm reminding it where to go," Ethan replied. She nodded once, satisfied. Word traveled downhill faster than water. By noon, 2 men appeared on the lower path, boots sinking into mud with each step. One was Carter Blinn, a lean man in his early 30s with sharp features and a restless energy that showed in the way his fingers never quite stopped moving. His dark hair was slicked back under a cap, and a thin scar traced his right wrist, pale against his skin. Carter worked for Gideon Rourke, hauling timber and doing the kind of tasks that didn't come with job descriptions. He wasn't cruel by nature, but life had taught him to follow power rather than question it. The second man was a stranger, broad-shouldered, heavier around the middle, wearing a county-issued rain jacket. His name, he said, was Paul Henrik, an inspector sent to have a look. Paul Henrik was in his late 50s, with a ruddy complexion and thinning blonde hair plastered to his scalp by the rain. His face had the sagging lines of someone who'd spent decades outdoors, but still preferred a desk. He carried a clipboard like a shield. His eyes skimmed Ethan's work without landing on any one detail long enough to understand it. "Got a call about unauthorized excavation," Paul said, tone neutral to the point of boredom. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans. "I'm not excavating. I'm redirecting runoff where erosion's already started." Paul squinted at the channels. "You have a permit?" "No." Paul sighed, the sound of a man disappointed not by danger but by inconvenience. "Then technically—" Val stepped closer, her presence sudden and silent. Paul flinched, then recovered, clearing his throat. Carter smirked faintly, eyes flicking between Ethan and the dog. "Dog's impressive," Carter said, "but Gideon says this hill's stable. Been that way for decades." Ethan met Carter's gaze. "Decades don't mean much when the ground's soaked through." Paul shifted, uncomfortable. "Look, I'll note it. But unless there's immediate risk to structures, the county's not authorizing anything. And you," he added, pointing his pen at Ethan, "should stop before someone gets hurt." After they left, Val stood watching the path long after they disappeared, muscles tight. Ethan felt the familiar burn of frustration settle behind his eyes. Authority, when it moved at all, moved slowly. Water didn't. That afternoon, the first sabotage came quietly. Ethan returned from hauling stones to find several of his placed rocks scattered downhill. Channels partially collapsed as if kicked apart. He didn't need Val to tell him it was deliberate. Boot prints cut through the mud, deep and careless. Carter's boots, likely, or someone else's, sent with the same message. Ethan rebuilt without comment. He worked until his shoulders ached and his left knee sent sharp reminders with every crouch. Val stayed close, occasionally darting ahead to check ground before Ethan stepped. As dusk settled, the rain intensified, drumming harder, the sound flattening the forest into a single unbroken note. Down in Juniper Ridge, The mood shifted from irritation to unease. The creek climbed another foot by evening, and the road inspection stretched into a full closure. Lila closed the diner early, wiping tables that didn't need wiping, her jaw set tight. Noah pressed his face to the window, watching the rain streak sideways, asking questions she didn't yet know how to answer. Sheriff Mara Keene drove up the slope just before dark, her cruiser's tires slipping slightly on the wet track. She stepped out, jacket zipped to her chin, rain beating on her lashes. She took in the channels, the reinforced edges, the way water flowed where Ethan had guided it. "You've been busy," she said. "Someone has to be," Ethan replied. She crouched, ran a hand through the water, felt its speed. Her mouth tightened. "County won't move fast enough," she admitted. "They never do." "Then we shouldn't wait for them," Ethan said. She stood, rain dripping from the brim of her cap. "If this goes wrong, it already is," he said quietly. Mara studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "I can't officially sanction this, but I can look the other way if you're not putting anyone directly at risk." It was the closest thing to support she could offer without breaking under the weight of procedure. Night fell hard. Wind joined the rain, bending branches until they groaned. Ethan worked by headlamp, Val's eyes reflecting the light like twin embers. Around midnight, a deeper tremor shuddered through the ground, enough to send small stones rattling downhill. Val barked twice, short, sharp. Ethan froze, then retreated to firmer ground just as a narrow strip of earth slid away, exposing raw, slick clay beneath. The slide stopped after a few feet, but the message was unmistakable. Somewhere downslope, a tree cracked and fell, the sound carrying through the storm like a warning shot. By morning, exhaustion clung to Ethan like wet clothes. He stood on the porch, watching the damaged section, calculating angles, distances, the minimum he'd need to keep the hillside from tearing itself open. He knew now that small measures wouldn't be enough. What he'd started as a test was becoming a necessity. Longer channels, stronger barriers, something built to hold under real pressure. Val leaned against his leg, steady and warm. Ethan rested a hand on her head, grounding himself in the simple fact of her presence. Below them, Juniper Ridge stirred uneasily, unaware that the line between inconvenience and catastrophe had thinned to a few inches of saturated earth. Ethan had crossed a threshold. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was committing, and commitment, he knew, came with consequences. The fourth day of rain broke something in the rhythm of Juniper Ridge. It wasn't dramatic, no thunderclap, no sudden wall of water, but the air carried a tension that pressed against the skin, as if the town itself had drawn a shallow breath and forgotten how to let it out. Ethan crossly felt it the moment he stepped off his porch before dawn. The ground no longer merely yielded under his boots, it resisted, then softened in a way that suggested fatigue rather than weakness, like a muscle pushed past endurance. Val moved ahead of him, slower than usual, her head low, nose working constantly. At 5 years old, she was still at the height of her physical strength, lean and precise, but experience had tempered her energy into something sharper. She no longer rushed warnings, she measured them. When she stopped near the exposed clay seam from the night before, she did not bark. She sat, ears forward, gaze fixed on the slope below. That choice mattered. Sitting meant certainty. Ethan followed her line of sight and saw the change immediately. The small slide had widened overnight, not by inches but by feet, peeling back the hillside to reveal a slick gray underlayer that glistened with trapped water. It looked like a wound that refused to clot. He crouched and touched the edge with the tip of his spade. The soil sloughed away at the slightest pressure. "That's it," he said quietly. "You're done pretending." He spent the morning expanding the channels downslope, working farther from the cabin than before. Each movement was deliberate, conservative, as if he were negotiating with something that might take offense at haste. Val shadowed him, sometimes circling wide, sometimes returning to stand close enough that her shoulder brushed his knee. Once, when Ethan misjudged a step and felt the ground slide half an inch beneath him, Val snapped a short warning and braced against his leg, giving him the extra balance he needed to recover. By late morning, the rain thinned to a cold mist. That was when the first volunteers appeared, not in a rush, not in numbers, but one by one, as if curiosity had finally outweighed caution. Lucas Reed came first, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jacket, beard wet and untrimmed. He stood at a distance, watching the water trace the channels. "Never seen runoff behave like that," Lucas said. "It's calmer." "Because it's not trapped," Ethan replied. "Water panics when it doesn't have a way out." Lucas nodded slowly. "I've got a post-hole digger, if you need it." Ethan accepted with a brief nod. No speeches, no gratitude beyond what the moment required. An hour later, May Holloway returned, leading Bramble with a rope loose in her hand. She brought 2 burlap sacks filled with smaller stones, the kind that fit neatly into gaps and held edges together. Bramble stood patiently, rain darkening his chestnut coat, white blaze stark against the gray morning. His age showed in the slight sway of his hips, but his temperament remained unshaken. Animals, May often said, knew when stillness mattered. The most unexpected arrival came near midday. A battered green pickup climbed the lower path, tires spinning briefly before catching. The driver stepped out with visible effort, favoring his right leg. His name was Thomas Hale, a retired civil engineer who had moved to Juniper Ridge years earlier after a stroke ended his career. He was in his late 60s, tall even now, with a narrow frame that had once been athletic. His hair was white and cropped short, his beard trimmed close along a jaw still sharply defined. One side of his mouth pulled slightly downward when he spoke, a remnant of the stroke, and his right hand trembled faintly when he reached for tools. The tremor embarrassed him more than the weakness ever had. "I heard you're trying to teach a hill some manners," Thomas said, voice dry, eyes bright with interest. "Mind if I look?" Ethan showed him the channels, the marked trees, the exposed clay. Thomas crouched carefully, testing the ground with the toe of his boot, then smiled. A thin, thoughtful smile that belonged to a man who had solved problems for a living. "You're right," Thomas said. "This slope's got a memory. Old logging cuts, buried drainage, maybe a failed culvert. Water's following paths that aren't visible anymore." He straightened with a grunt. "You're going to need a diversion barrier, angled, not too high, enough to break momentum." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. "I was thinking the same," Thomas nodded. "I figured you were." They worked together through the afternoon, sketching lines in the mud with a stick, arguing angles, compromising on materials. Lucas fetched the post-hole digger. May brought more stones. No one said the word permission, but it hovered nearby, unnecessary. This wasn't a project anymore. It was a response. Down in town, Gideon Rourke noticed the change before he understood it. From the window of his office, he saw trucks parked where they hadn't been before, people moving uphill with tools instead of excuses. He drove up himself, boots clean, coat pressed, the rain barely touching him. He stood at the edge of the worksite, jaw tight, eyes calculating. "You don't have approval for this," Gideon said, voice carrying without effort. Ethan didn't look up. He was setting a post, Lucas holding it steady. "Then stop the rain," Ethan replied. Gideon's gaze flicked to Thomas Hale, recognition dawning. "You," Gideon said, "you know better than this." Thomas met his stare evenly. "I know exactly what this is." Gideon's mouth hardened. "If something goes wrong," "It already has," Thomas said. "You just haven't priced it yet." Gideon left without another word, but the tension he carried lingered like a bruise. That night, the rain returned with renewed force. Wind drove it sideways, flattening the forest into a single, restless motion. Ethan and Val stayed awake, monitoring the barrier's first section, a rough structure of posts, cross-bracing, and stone meant to slow, not stop, the flow. When the water surged, it struck the barrier and split, part of it diverting into the extended channels, part spilling harmlessly into the lower brush. The structure shuddered, but held. Val barked once when a larger surge hit, then settled again, eyes tracking movement in the dark. Ethan leaned against a post, feeling vibration travel through wood and bone alike. He thought of all the times he'd waited for something worse, all the nights when inaction had felt safer than commitment. The hill didn't allow that luxury. It remembered every cut, every neglect, every assumption made at its expense. Near midnight, a second, deeper tremor rolled through the slope. The barrier flexed. Water foamed white for a moment, then steadied. No slide followed. Ethan laughed once, short and incredulous. The sound ripped from him before he could stop it. Val glanced up, tail giving a single, restrained wag. By dawn, exhaustion weighed on everyone. Lucas sat on a rock, rubbing his hands. May leaned against Bramble's shoulder. Thomas rested on his tailgate, breathing carefully. The barrier stood, scarred but intact. The channels ran full but controlled. Juniper Ridge woke to the news not of disaster, but of effort. People came to look, to ask questions, to offer tools. Sheriff Mara Keene arrived and took it all in without speaking, her expression unreadable until she finally said, "You bought us time." Ethan nodded. "Time's all I was aiming for." She studied the hill, the water, the people who had gathered without orders. "Then let's not waste it." Above them, the slope held, not because it had forgiven the town, but because for the first time in a long while, someone had listened to what it was saying. The fifth morning broke without rain, and that absence felt louder than the storms that had come before. Juniper Ridge woke under a low ceiling of clouds that did not move, did not thin, did not promise relief. The creek still ran high, its surface restless, carrying branches and foam in a steady, impatient rush. To Ethan Crossley, the quiet was not peace. It was a pause. He stood at the upper barrier with Val beside him, both of them watching the water test the structure as if probing for weakness. Val was alert but calmer than the previous night, her breathing even, ears rotating slowly to catalog sound. Mud clung to her legs up to the knee joints, darkening her fawn coat, but she showed no sign of fatigue. At 5 years old, she was built for sustained effort, her lean frame and deep chest designed to keep going long after humans needed rest. Ethan envied that sometimes. Below them, a small group had already gathered. Lucas Reed leaned against a shovel, shoulders hunched in his jacket, eyes narrowed as he studied the slope. May Holloway stood with Bramble tied loosely to a post, the old horse's head lowered, eyelids half closed as if conserving energy. Thomas Hale sat on an overturned crate, rubbing his right hand absently, the tremor more pronounced after the long night. None of them spoke much. They didn't need to. The hill was doing enough talking for everyone. It was Thomas who finally broke the silence. "The barrier held," he said, voice measured. "But it redirected more water than I expected. That means pressure's building farther down." Ethan nodded. "The creek." "Exactly." As if summoned by the word, a sharp crack echoed from below, followed by a sound like fabric tearing. Val's head snapped toward the noise, body instantly taut. Ethan felt it in his chest before he saw it, a section of the creek bank collapsing inward, water surging through the gap with sudden aggression. It wasn't catastrophic, not yet, but it was decisive. The creek was no longer content to stay in its channel. They moved without discussion. Lucas jogged downhill to warn the houses closest to the water. May untied Bramble and led him toward higher ground, the horse compliant but alert, nostrils flaring at the sharp scent of disturbed earth. Ethan and Thomas followed the water's new path, boots slipping as the ground softened under the fresh surge. Near the lower bend, they found Sheriff Mara Keene already there, radio in hand, rain jacket flapping open. Her face was tight, jaw clenched as she assessed the damage. Mud streaked her pants, and there was a cut on her knuckle she hadn't bothered to bandage. "We've got seepage under 3 foundations," she said. "Nothing's gone yet, but it will if this keeps up." A man stood ankle-deep in water nearby, trying to stack sandbags with hands that shook too badly to be effective. His name was Oliver Grant, a thin, stooped man in his early 70s with wire-rimmed glasses perpetually sliding down his nose. He had taught history at the local high school for decades before retiring, and the habit of explaining things carefully had never left him. Now, fear stripped that habit down to something raw. "My wife's inside," Oliver said, voice cracking. "She can't move fast anymore." Ethan didn't hesitate. He handed his pack to Thomas and stepped toward the house, Val right at his side. The structure was small, wood frame, its porch sagging with age. Water lapped at the bottom step. Inside, the air smelled of old books and damp carpet. Ethan found Oliver's wife, Ruth, seated in a worn armchair, her hair white and neatly combed despite the chaos. Arthritis had curled her hands inward, but her eyes were sharp, assessing Ethan with calm intelligence. I suppose this isn't a social call, she said. No, ma'am, Ethan replied gently, but we're going to move you. With Val guiding the narrow path and Thomas helping from behind, they got Ruth out and uphill just as another section of bank gave way, water surging into the space she'd occupied minutes earlier. Oliver wept openly, clutching his wife's shoulders, gratitude and terror tangled together. News spread fast after that, faster than fear, faster than denial. People began moving belongings uphill, some calmly, some in a panic. Lila closed the diner again and joined the effort, Noah at her side carrying a backpack stuffed with essentials. Noah's face was pale but determined. He stayed close to Val whenever he could, drawing courage from the dog's steady presence. The next blow came from a different direction. Mid-afternoon, as Ethan and Thomas reinforced a secondary diversion trench, Carter Blinn appeared again, this time with 2 other men from Gideon Rourke's operation. They were younger, broader, built from hauling logs rather than thinking about water. Their boots were clean, their expressions guarded. Gideon wants this shut down, Carter said, not meeting Ethan's eyes. There was tension in his jaw, a conflict he wasn't skilled enough to hide. Says you're making it worse, drawing water where it wouldn't go otherwise. Ethan straightened slowly. Mud streaked his sleeves, his hands raw from work. The water's already going there. I'm just choosing where it breaks. One of the men snorted. You're not an engineer. Thomas stepped forward, shoulders squared despite his tremor. I am, he said quietly. And he's right. Carter hesitated. He looked at the swollen creek, the exposed bank, the people carrying furniture uphill behind them. Something shifted in his expression, not conviction, but doubt. Doubt was enough. I don't want anyone hurt, Carter said finally. Then help, Ethan replied. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Carter reached for a shovel. The sky darkened again toward evening, clouds thickening, promising another round of rain. The temporary safety they'd carved out felt fragile, dependent on hands that were already shaking with fatigue. As dusk fell, Val began to pace more frequently, stopping to sniff the air, tail low. Her signals were subtle but unmistakable. Something bigger was coming. Thomas pulled Ethan aside. We need a wider evacuation route, he said. If the creek jumps again, this section will go fast. Ethan looked at the terrain, the houses clustered too close to the water. He thought of Noah, of Ruth, of people who trusted him now because he'd acted when others hadn't. The weight of it pressed hard against his ribs. We start cutting, he said, now. They worked into the night, lanterns casting unsteady light as rain returned in earnest. The creek rose another inch, then 2. The evacuation path took shape under frantic effort, a rough but navigable line toward higher ground. Val ran ahead and back, checking footing, barking sharp warnings when the ground shifted unexpectedly. Once, she skidded on slick mud and recovered instantly, shaking off the slip as if insulted by it. Just before midnight, a sound tore through the storm, a deep, rolling crack that vibrated through bone. The creek surged violently, overtopping the damaged bank in a foaming rush. People screamed. Someone fell. Ethan grabbed blindly, hauling a body upright, heart hammering. Val barked continuously now, a clear, urgent alarm. Move! Mara shouted, voice raw. Everyone, move now! The evacuation route filled with bodies, wet and shaking, but moving. The trench held just long enough to slow the water, just long enough to keep it from sweeping the path away. Ethan stood at the edge, guiding people through, hands outstretched, shouting directions until his voice went hoarse. When the surge finally eased, it left behind devastation, but not the worst case Ethan had feared. Houses were damaged, foundations compromised, but lives were intact. The creek had spoken, loudly and clearly, and this time Juniper Ridge had listened. As dawn crept in again, pale and exhausted, Ethan sank onto a rock near the path, Val pressing against his side. His hands shook now, adrenaline bleeding away. He looked at the water, at the broken bank, at the people huddled together on higher ground. This was no longer about prevention alone. It was about survival. And the hill, the creek, the town, all of it had crossed a line together. The rain did not ease after midnight. It thickened, as if the sky had decided restraint was no longer necessary. Juniper Ridge lay under a relentless curtain of water, every surface slick, every sound muted. except for the roar of the creek and the wind tearing through the trees. Floodlights from Sheriff Marrakeen's cruiser cut pale cones through the darkness, illuminating faces drawn tight with exhaustion and fear. What had begun as a cautious evacuation had turned into a vigil. The entire town waiting to see whether the land would take more than it already had. Ethan Crossley stood near the head of the evacuation route, soaked through, his jacket heavy with water and mud. His hands were scraped raw, nails split, knuckles swollen, but he barely noticed. The night demanded attention, not comfort. Val stayed glued to his side, her body angled toward the creek, muscles coiled. The Belgian Malinois no longer barked indiscriminately. Every sound she made carried intent. When she barked now, it was short and directional, her head snapping toward specific danger points like an arrow finding its mark. A sudden shout rose from the lower end of the route. "Someone's still down there!" Ethan turned, heart dropping. He followed the sound toward a cluster of lanterns, where Marrakeen stood knee-deep in water, radio pressed to her ear. Beside her was a man Ethan hadn't seen before, clinging to a fence post half submerged by the surge. He was broad and heavyset, late 50s perhaps, with a thick gray beard plastered to his chest by rain and a face flushed from panic and exertion. His name, shouted by someone nearby, was Henry Cole. He owned a small bait shop by the creek and had stubbornly stayed behind to secure his equipment until it was too late. "My leg's stuck," Henry gasped. "I can't feel my foot." Ethan waded forward without hesitation, Val forging ahead, water splitting around her chest. The current was stronger here, pushing hard against Ethan's thighs, trying to steal his balance. He reached Henry and crouched, bracing himself against the fence. Henry's boot was wedged beneath a collapsed plank, pressure pinning it against the mud. "Don't pull yet," Ethan said, voice calm despite the chaos. "You'll break something." Val nosed the water around the trapped leg, sniffing rapidly. She let out a low, insistent growl and began pawing at the mud downstream of the plank, loosening the suction. Ethan timed it, lifting the board just enough to relieve pressure. Together, they freed Henry's leg and hauled him upright moments before a fresh surge tore the fence loose and swept it away. Henry collapsed onto higher ground, sobbing openly. Ethan didn't linger. He scanned the water again, chest tight. The night wasn't done taking chances. Farther uphill, Lila Hartman huddled under a tarp with Noah and several other families. Her hair clung wetly to her cheeks, freckles stark against pale skin. She kept one arm around Noah's shoulders, the other gripping a flashlight that trembled slightly despite her effort to stay steady. When she saw Ethan pass, she called out, "Everyone from the lower bend is here. I counted twice." Ethan nodded, relief sharp enough to hurt. Then Val stopped. She stiffened so suddenly Ethan nearly stumbled into her, her ears flattened, tail rigid, nose lifted into the rain-laced air. She let out a long, urgent bark, not the sharp warning she'd used earlier, but something deeper, more insistent. Ethan felt it in his bones before he saw it. The hillside above the creek was moving. The sound came low and continuous, like thunder dragged underground. A wide section of saturated earth began to slide, not fast at first, but with terrifying inevitability. Trees tilted, roots snapping free with dull pops. The barrier they had built higher up was nowhere near this section. If the slide reached the creek, it would displace enough water to send a wave straight through the evacuation zone. "Mara!" Ethan shouted. "Pull everyone back, now!" There was no time for debate. Marrakeen's voice cut through the storm, sharp and commanding, ordering people uphill, farther than before. Panic threatened to take over, but Val ran ahead of the crowd, barking and darting along the safest path, her movements instinctively guiding people away from unstable ground. Children cried, adults stumbled, hands reached out blindly. Ethan stayed at the edge, counting, scanning, refusing to move until the last person cleared the zone. His left knee screamed in protest as he pivoted, pain flaring bright enough to make his vision blur. He ignored it. He had ignored worse. The slide accelerated. A wall of mud, broken trees, and rocks surged downward, hitting the creek with a force that sent water exploding outward in a violent arc. The sound was deafening. The ground shook hard enough to knock Ethan off his feet. He hit the mud, breath knocked from his lungs, Val skidding into his side as she fought to keep her footing. For a moment, the world reduced itself to noise and pressure and darkness. Then it was over. The wave rushed through the area they had evacuated seconds earlier, tearing away sandbags, ripping into empty spaces where people had stood. But the route was clear. No one was there to be taken. Ethan pushed himself up on trembling arms, chest burning, rain stinging his eyes. Val stood over him, teeth bared at the chaos, then leaned in to press her head hard against his chest, grounding him in the aftermath. He wrapped an arm around her neck, breathing in the familiar scent beneath the mud and rain. Dawn arrived hesitantly, light filtering through torn clouds. The damage revealed itself slowly. Several homes near the creek were gone, reduced to debris scattered along the floodplain. The road was destroyed in 2 places. The bait shop Henry Cole owned had vanished entirely, but the hillside above, the one that truly threatened to wipe Juniper Ridge from the map, had released its worst without taking lives. People gathered on the high ground, silent, staring at what remained. Some cried quietly. Others stood in shock, hands hanging uselessly at their sides. Lila hugged Noah tightly, her face buried in his hair. Mara Keene walked the perimeter, checking names, confirming counts, her posture rigid with the weight of responsibility she carried. Gideon Rourke appeared just after sunrise, his clothes soaked, boots ruined, the polish stripped away. He stood apart at first, staring at the devastation with an expression Ethan had never seen on his face before. Uncertainty. When he finally approached, his shoulders were hunched, his voice subdued. "That slide," Gideon said. "If it had hit an hour earlier." Ethan didn't answer. Gideon swallowed. "You saved this town." Silence stretched between them. Val watched Gideon closely, head tilted, assessing. Ethan finally spoke, voice hoarse. "The town saved itself. It just needed time." Gideon nodded once sharply as if accepting a verdict. As the morning wore on, people began to move again. Not with panic now, but purpose. Blankets were distributed. Fires were lit where possible. Thomas Hale coordinated temporary reinforcements with the precision of a man returned to his calling. Lucas Reed organized debris clearing. Carter Blinn worked without being asked, his jaw set, eyes focused, no longer looking over his shoulder for approval. Ethan sat on a rock overlooking the creek, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. Val lay beside him, sides rising and falling steadily, eyes half-lidded but alert. The danger had not passed entirely, but the worst night, the one that would be spoken of in quiet tones for years, was behind them. Juniper Ridge had been tested, and it had bent, but it had not broken. And for the first time since Ethan arrived on that hill, he felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest alongside the fatigue. Not fear, not vigilance, but the fragile beginning of belonging. Morning did not bring clarity so much as it revealed exhaustion. The rain had thinned to a cold drizzle, the kind that felt less like weather and more like residue, clinging to everything it touched. Juniper Ridge looked stripped down to its essentials: mud, broken timber, the creek swollen and restless, the slope above it scarred but finally still. People moved slowly now, as if any sudden motion might wake the land again. Ethan Crossley stood near the upper edge of the slide, boots sunk deep in muck, surveying what remained. The hillside had released a wide swath of earth, a raw diagonal cut exposing layers of clay and stone that looked older than the town itself. Val paced beside him, no longer tense but not relaxed either. Her coat had dried unevenly, darkened in patches, and a faint limp showed when she turned too quickly. Nothing serious, just a reminder that even the strongest bodies paid a price. She shook once, water spraying in a fine arc, then pressed her shoulder against Ethan's thigh, grounding him. Below, the town gathered itself. Fires burned in metal barrels, blankets were draped over shoulders. Sheriff Mara Keene coordinated with a voice gone hoarse, her movements precise despite the fatigue that pulled at her posture. She had slept maybe an hour on the hood of her cruiser, jacket pulled tight, and it showed in the deepened lines around her eyes. Yet she moved with renewed focus now, as if the worst having passed allowed her to finally plan instead of react. Thomas Hale worked a whiteboard salvaged from the school, sketching diagrams with a shaking hand. He had steadied himself with purpose. The tremor lessened when he spoke, confidence overriding frailty. "Temporary berm here," he said, tapping the board. "Permanent diversion farther upslope. If we don't want a repeat, we need to respect where the water wants to go." Lucas Reed organized teams to clear debris from the road, his earlier cynicism replaced by a practical determination. He barked instructions with surprising authority, beard dripping, jacket discarded. Carter Blinn hauled timbers with the others, no longer glancing toward the ridge for Gideon Rourke's approval. When someone asked him what Gideon wanted done, Carter shrugged. "What needs doing?" he said, and kept working. Gideon himself stood near the remains of the creek bank, silent, hands jammed into his coat pockets. The man looked diminished without his clean boots and confident posture. Mud streaked his trousers. His beard, usually neat, had gone wild. For the first time, he seemed to be listening rather than calculating. He watched Ethan from a distance, eyes narrowed not with contempt but concentration, as if reassessing the measure of a man he had misjudged. The relief station took shape in the school gym. Cots lined the walls. A generator hummed. Lila Hartman moved through the space with quiet efficiency, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back tighter than usual. She checked names against a list, handed out coffee, coaxed smiles from children who needed permission to stop being brave. Noah stayed close to Val whenever he could, offering the dog bits of jerky from his pocket with solemn gratitude. Val accepted the offerings delicately, tail giving a single, dignified wag. Late that afternoon, county officials arrived in a convoy of SUVs, their tires splashing through puddles as if surprised by the inconvenience. Leading them was Deputy Director Alan Whitmore, a tall man in his early 50s with a narrow face, silvering hair combed carefully into place, and a habit of speaking as though every sentence might be quoted later. His suit was ill-suited to the mud, but he wore it anyway, a shield of formality. With him came 2 engineers and a communications officer who kept glancing at her phone, eyes flicking between the screen and the devastation with poorly concealed anxiety. Whitmore listened to Mara's report, nodded at Thomas's diagrams, then turned to Ethan. "You took initiative," he said, "without authorization." "I took responsibility," Ethan replied evenly. Whitmore studied him, weighing optics against outcomes. "The county will conduct a full assessment," he said. "In the meantime, we'll install temporary barriers and consider relocation assistance for affected homes." "Consider," Thomas repeated, unimpressed. Before Whitmore could respond, a woman stepped forward from the cluster of townspeople. Her name was Elaine Porter, a nurse who worked nights at the regional hospital. She was in her late 40s, medium height, sturdy build, with dark hair pulled into a low bun and eyes that had seen enough pain to cut through pretense. "With respect," she said, voice steady, "we don't need consideration. We need action, and we need to keep the man who read the Hill involved." Murmurs of agreement followed. Whitmore cleared his throat. The moment had slipped beyond his control. That evening, a community meeting convened in the gym. Lights buzzing overhead. Ethan stood near the back, Val at his feet, content to observe. He was unused to crowds that watched him with expectation rather than suspicion. Gideon rose from his seat at the front, the movement drawing immediate attention. He hesitated, a rare thing for him, then spoke. "I opposed what happened on that hill," Gideon said. "I was wrong." The admission cost him visibly. "I own resources, lumber, equipment. I'm putting them at the town's disposal, no conditions." He turned toward Ethan. "If you're willing to lead, I won't stand in the way again." Silence followed, thick with surprise. Ethan felt the weight of the offer settle heavy in his chest. Leadership meant exposure. It meant staying. Val shifted, sensing his hesitation, then looked up at him, eyes clear and certain. She had chosen the work without fear. Perhaps he could too. "I'll help," Ethan said finally. "But this isn't about me. It's about building something that outlasts the next storm." The room exhaled as one. Over the next days, the work began in earnest. Permanent trenches were marked, angled retaining walls planned, evacuation routes widened and reinforced. Thomas coordinated designs with the county engineers, challenging assumptions and winning arguments with calm logic. Lucas kept crews moving. Carter proved tireless. May Holloway brought Bramble to haul stones where machinery couldn't reach. The old horse moved with patient determination, ears flicking, hooves sure. Val adapted to a new role, no longer only a warning system, but a constant reassurance. She checked ground ahead of crews, stayed with frightened children, slept lightly near Ethan's cot at night. Her limp faded as the days passed. One afternoon, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, Gideon found Ethan on the ridge. "I used to think control was strength," Gideon said quietly. "Turns out it's listening." Ethan nodded. "The hill taught us both." When the first permanent barrier went in, a cheer rose, not loud but sustained, like a promise. Juniper Ridge was scarred, yes, but it was also awake. The water had taken what it would. What remained was choice. As dusk settled, Ethan sat on the ridge with Val, watching lanterns glow below. The land was quiet, not silent, but settled. For the first time since he arrived, Ethan felt the future extend beyond vigilance. It felt like work, shared and honest, and for now, that was enough. Spring did not arrive all at once in Juniper Ridge. It came cautiously, like a guest unsure whether they were truly welcome yet. The rain softened first, losing its relentless edge, turning into brief showers that passed through instead of settling in. Then, the clouds began to lift for longer stretches, revealing pale blue skies that felt almost unfamiliar. New grass pushed through disturbed soil along the hillsides, thin at first but stubborn. The land, scarred and reshaped, was learning how to rest again. Ethan Crossley stood on the ridge where the permanent diversion wall curved along the slope, hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the finished work. The structure was not elegant, but it was sound, angled timber reinforced with stone, anchored deep into stable ground, designed to slow and guide water rather than challenge it. Below it, the widened channels traced deliberate paths toward safer lowlands, and the reinforced evacuation routes cut clean, reliable lines through terrain that had once been treacherous. Nothing about it felt temporary anymore. Val lay nearby in the sun, her coat finely clean, the fawn fur along her sides catching the light. At 5 years old, she still moved with the precision of a working K9, but there was a new ease in her posture now. The faint limp from the long night had disappeared weeks ago. She rolled once onto her side, stretched her legs, then rose smoothly when a sound caught her attention. Old habits never left her. They simply adapted. Downhill, Juniper Ridge moved with purpose. Houses damaged by the flood had been repaired or relocated to higher ground. Fresh lumber framed new porches and reinforced foundations. Children rode bicycles again, laughter echoing where only the sound of rushing water had existed before. The town no longer felt like a place holding its breath. Thomas Hale supervised the final inspection with a clipboard in hand, his white beard trimmed neatly now, posture straighter than it had been in years. The tremor in his right hand remained, but it no longer embarrassed him. He had reclaimed something essential by being needed again. When the county engineers challenged one of his recommendations, he countered calmly. Logic precise, experience undeniable. They deferred. Lucas Reed leaned against a post nearby, arms crossed, watching a crew finish laying stone. His beard was still untrimmed, but his expression had softened. He no longer spoke like a man waiting for disappointment. He spoke like someone invested. Carter Blinn worked alongside the others, sweat darkening his shirt, movement steady and confident. He had quit Gideon Rourke's company 2 weeks earlier and now ran logistics for the rebuilding crews, a role that suited him better than obedience ever had. Gideon himself stood a little apart, sleeves rolled, hands roughened by honest labor. The change in him was not theatrical. It was quiet. His voice no longer dominated meetings. Instead, he listened, asked questions, and followed through. He had funded materials, yes, but more importantly, he had learned when to step aside. The experience had stripped him of the illusion that control equaled strength. Near the base of the ridge, May Holloway guided Bramble along a narrow path, the old horse hauling a final load of stones. Bramble's chestnut coat gleamed with health, his white blaze bright. Age had slowed him, but purpose had kept him strong. May walked beside him, one hand resting on his neck, her lined face relaxed. When the work was done, Bramble would return to lighter days, but his contribution would be remembered in the bones of the place. The dedication ceremony was modest, held on a clear afternoon when the air smelled of pine and damp earth rather than fear. People gathered near the main diversion channel, standing shoulder to shoulder. Sheriff Mara Keene stepped forward first, uniform crisp, expression open in a way few had seen before. "We can't pretend this town is invincible," she said, But we can say with certainty that we are prepared, and we owe that to people who acted when it mattered. She gestured toward Ethan. A ripple moved through the crowd. Ethan felt it press against him, that familiar urge to step back, to disappear into the edges. Val sensed it instantly. She stepped closer, pressing her shoulder into his leg, steady and solid. He took a breath and moved forward. Lila Hartman stood in the front row with Noah at her side. Noah's hair had grown shaggier, his confidence broader. When Ethan met his eyes, the boy smiled without hesitation. Nearby, Oliver and Ruth Grant held hands, their home rebuilt on higher ground. Henry Cole leaned on a cane fashioned from driftwood salvaged after the flood, his beard neatly combed, his stubbornness finely tempered by gratitude. Thomas Hale spoke next, voice clear. This system works because it respects the land. It doesn't fight the water, it listens to it. That philosophy saved us. A simple wooden sign was unveiled beside the channel, carved by a local craftsman. The lettering was unpretentious, almost shy. Juniper Ridge Community Waterway, built together, held together. Ethan hadn't asked for his name to be included. He didn't need it. The work spoke loudly enough. When applause rose, it was not thunderous. It was sustained, heartfelt, the sound of acknowledgement rather than spectacle. Ethan nodded once, awkward but sincere. Later, as people drifted away, the ridge grew quiet again. Ethan sat on a rock overlooking the town, Val beside him. The sun dipped low, painting the rebuilt rooftops gold. The creek flowed within its guided path, still powerful, but no longer threatening. "You did good," Mara Keene said, stopping nearby. She had removed her hat, dark hair tousled by the breeze. This place needed someone who didn't flinch. Ethan shrugged lightly. It needed a dog who listened. Val flicked an ear, accepting the compliment without ceremony. That evening, Ethan walked back up the ridge to his cabin, but for the first time, it didn't feel like retreat. It felt like choice. Below him, Juniper Ridge glowed with warm lights, steady and unafraid. The land was quiet, not silent, but balanced. Val settled on the porch as the stars emerged, head resting on her paws, eyes half closed but vigilant. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, breathing in the cool night air. He had come to Juniper Ridge to be alone. He stayed because he was needed. Somewhere between the rain and the rebuilding, the hill had taught him something he hadn't learned in war. Survival wasn't just about holding ground. It was about learning when to trust it again. The creek flowed. The barriers held. The town endured. And for the first time in a long while, so did he. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a tired man who refuses to walk away, a loyal dog who senses danger before anyone else, and a community that learns to listen just in time. This story reminds us that God often works through ordinary hands, steady hearts, and unseen acts of courage. Through those who choose to serve when no one is watching, through those who stay when leaving would be easier, through love that shows up before fear takes over. In our daily lives, we may not face floods or falling hillsides, but we all face storms, moments of doubt, loneliness, and quiet battles no one else sees. And just like in this story, sometimes the miracle isn't that the storm disappears, but that God places someone beside us so we don't face it alone. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder. Your kindness may be the miracle someone else is praying for. Please take a moment to share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories of faith, courage, and second chances. May God watch over you and your loved ones. May He guide your steps, calm every storm in your life, and remind you, especially in the darkest moments, that you are never forgotten. Amen.